The first thing I noticed about Cresthaven was that it smelled like territory that didn't want me. Every town has a scent signature, layered pheromones pressed into the soil, the walls, the very air currents that roll between buildings. Most people can't consciously detect it, but Omegas don't have the luxury of ignorance. We're wired for it, built to read those invisible chemical signals the way others read road signs. And what Cresthaven was broadcasting, in no uncertain terms, was a cold and efficient message: you do not belong here. I sat in the parking lot of a gas station on the edge of town for almost 10 minutes before I could make myself get out of the car. My hands were still on the steering wheel, engine idling, heat blasting because the late autumn had teeth this far north. The gas gauge was kissing empty. My wallet had $43 in it, which needed to cover gas, food, and whatever passed for hope in a town that had never heard my name. I was 24 years old, unmated, unregistered with any pack, and driving a car I'd inherited from a grandmother who'd been the only person in my family who'd ever looked at me without flinching. Her name had been Eloise. She'd smelled like lavender and certainty. The car still caught traces of her sometimes, when the sun warmed the upholstery just right. I got out. The cold hit me like a reprimand. The gas station attendant watched me through the window with the particular blankness that people in tight-knit pack communities reserve for outsiders. Not hostility, not yet. Just assessment. The silent language of, "What are you, and who sent you here?" Just passing through? The attendant was a young woman, maybe 18, with the faint copper and ciderwood scent that marked her as a low-ranking pack member. Beta, probably. The kind of person who'd been raised knowing exactly where she stood in a hierarchy, who her people were, what she owed them, and what they owed her. There was a comfort in that, I suppose. I'd spent 24 years trying to imagine what it felt like. "Looking for work, actually," I said, keeping my voice easy. "Anything available in town?" She looked at me for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached under the counter and produced a handwritten flyer, slightly crinkled, the kind that had been printed and discarded and retrieved again. "The Preston estate," she said. "They've been hiring. Groundskeeping. Some interior staff. Boss is particular, but he pays decent." She slid it across the counter. I picked it up. Preston. The name hit the air of the gas station with a weight that made the attendant instinctively straighten, like someone had called attention in a room where she'd been lounging. Pack Alpha family names did that. Even spoken silently in ink on paper, they carried frequency. "Thank you," I said. She nodded, already looking away. "Conversation over. Don't linger." I didn't. Back in the car, I read the flyer twice. The address was on the north edge of town. The contact name at the bottom was handwritten in different ink than the rest, added later. Maybe Jacob Preston. Below it, a phone number. I sat there for another minute, turning it over. I needed money. I needed somewhere to stay. I had no local references, no pack affiliation to smooth the introduction, no Alpha's name I could drop to signal that I was someone's responsibility and therefore someone who could be trusted. What I had was a dead grandmother's car, $43, and an Omega's desperate optimism, which is different from regular optimism because it exists in full awareness of every reason it shouldn't. I started driving north. The Preston estate didn't announce itself with gates or grandeur, which surprised me. I'd expected the architectural arrogance of old money. Stone columns, a long private drive, some kind of visual argument for why this family deserved to own this much land. Instead, the drive was unpaved, lined with enormous silver-bark trees that had probably been standing before anyone in this town's family had been born. The house at the end of it was large, certainly, but the largeness felt earned rather than performed. Stone and dark timber, 2 stories. A covered porch that ran the full width of the front face. Smoke from a chimney, a garden in its winter dormancy. Beds mulched and wrapped, waiting. It looked, unexpectedly, like a place where someone actually lived. I parked and sat for a moment, doing the Omega thing I always did before entering a new space. Breathing in slow and deliberate, cataloging what the air told me before I had to rely on my eyes. The estate smelled like pine and old wood and something deeper underneath, like soil after rain. And over all of it, a thread of alpha scent so settled and sure that it might as well have been structural. Whoever lived here had been here a long time. Whatever territory claim existed in this place had been built over years, not asserted overnight. I got out. A dog appeared from around the corner of the house, not aggressive, just investigative. It sniffed my hand, decided I was acceptable, and disappeared back around the corner with an air of having completed an important task. I knocked. The door opened after about 30 seconds and I understood immediately why the gas station attendant had said boss is particular. Jacob Preston was, and I want to choose this word carefully because first impressions do a kind of violence if you're not deliberate about them. Arresting, not in a magazine cover way. In the way that made me feel like the air around him had different properties than the air elsewhere. He was tall, broad-shouldered, without being hulking, with dark hair that looked like it had been pushed back by a hand rather than styled, and eyes the color of deep water, that shade of gray-green that changes depending on the light. He was wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up despite the cold, and his hands, one of which held the door, were the hands of someone who actually worked this land rather than simply owning it. He was an alpha, obviously. The scent confirmation was almost redundant against the physical fact of him. But what struck me about his scent, where most pack alphas broadcast something territorial and assertive even at rest, was that his carried something quieter. Pine, yes. Stone, yes. But underneath that, something warm. Something that felt like a fire in a room you hadn't expected to find. He looked at me, not the calculating look of social assessment. Just looked. Gary Lewis? He said. I blinked. Yay, he said. I blinked. Yes, I called ahead. Right, come in. He stepped back, holding the door wider. You're earlier than I expected. Is that a problem? No. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. It's actually the opposite. He walked me through the ground floor of the house while he explained the position. He was direct, without being brusque, someone who valued words enough not to waste them. The estate ran about 40 acres, most of it wooded. Some of it maintained garden and grounds. His regular groundskeeper had taken a position in another city for family reasons. The interior staff was minimal. A cook who came 3 days a week, a cleaner once a week. What he needed was someone consistent, present, adaptable. Where are you staying? He asked, turning from the window where he'd been pointing out the property boundaries. I kept my face neutral. I haven't arranged accommodation yet. I drove up this morning. Something shifted in his expression. Not pity. I'd have recognized pity and stiffened against it, more like the recalibration of someone revising their initial read of a situation. Are you from far? Far enough. I let a beat pass. I don't have local ties, if that's what you're getting at. No pack affiliation in the area. I'm aware that's usually a consideration. There it was. The thing I always had to say out loud eventually. The thing that changed every room once it was said. Unaffiliated Omega. Packless. The polite term in administrative paperwork was unregistered. In a gas station parking lot or a pack bar, the term was stray. Jacob Preston looked at me for a long moment. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, exactly. It had the quality of actual thought rather than social hesitation. The property has a guest cottage, he said finally. It's been empty since spring. It's yours if you want it, rent included in the salary. That way you're on site. I stared at him. You're offering me housing. I'm offering you accommodation as part of a job package, he said, with the particular precision of someone making sure they weren't being misunderstood. Standard practice when the work requires on-site presence. I haven't taken the job yet. No. Again that almost smile. But you're going to. He wasn't wrong. I hated that he wasn't wrong. Show me the cottage, I said. The cottage was at the back of the property, maybe 200 yards from the main house, accessible by a stone path that wound through what was, even in November, a beautiful garden. In spring and summer I could only imagine what it looked like. Even stripped bare for winter, there was a structure to the plantings that spoke of someone who understood how growing things moved through time. The cottage itself was small and stone-walled and absolutely charming in a way that made me feel suspicious of it, because in my experience, things that looked like safety rarely were. It had one main room that served as living space and kitchen, a narrow bedroom, a bathroom with an actual clawfoot tub, and a fireplace that Jacob lit while I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, trying to look like someone for whom this was a normal Thursday and not someone who had slept in their car twice in the past month. The fire caught immediately. The room smelled like pine and old stone and something that I slowly identified with a jolt of complicated feeling as the edge of Jacob's scent. Not strong, not intrusive, just present. The way an alpha's territorial signature would naturally extend to outbuildings on his property. Under ordinary circumstances, that would have put me on alert. An omega alone in an alpha's home and an extension of his scented territory, the pack's safety protocols I'd spent years building would be screaming at me to leave. But the fire was warm, and something in Jacob Preston's scent, that unexpected undertone of warmth beneath the stone and pine, wasn't screaming. It was the opposite of screaming. It was very, very quiet, and I recognized this and refused to trust it yet, steady. "Bed's made up," he said, straightening from the fireplace. "There are towels in the bathroom. The kitchen's stocked with basics. I wasn't sure if you'd have a chance to shop." He said this last part with careful neutrality, the kind that's being deliberately applied to avoid making someone feel seen in a vulnerable way. He'd figured out I was broke, or close to it, and he'd quietly arranged it so that I wouldn't have to say so. "Thank you," I said, and meant it more than I'd meant that phrase in quite some time. He nodded once. "You can start Monday if that works. Tomorrow is yours." He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. This close, 6 feet, maybe less, his scent was clearer. Pine, stone, that warmth, and under all of it, something that my omega instincts were trying to tell me something about, something they were cataloging with an urgency I chose to ignore for the moment. "Mr. Preston." "Jacob," he said. "Jacob." The name sat strangely in my mouth, not badly, just strangely. "Why are you being this generous with someone you've only just met?" He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, thinking, genuinely. "My mother was an unaffiliated omega," he said at last. "For a while before she met my father. I know what that's like, secondhand." And secondhand was enough. He looked at me for one more of those direct, considering moments. "Get some rest, Gary. Monday morning, 7. He left. I stood in the cottage doorway and watched him walk back up the stone path toward the main house, hands in his pockets, unhurried. The silver-barked trees standing sentinel on either side of him. Then I closed the door and sat down on the stone hearth in front of the fire, pulled my knees to my chest, and allowed myself 3 minutes of feeling everything I'd been holding at arm's length for the past 3 months, the exhaustion, the relief, the terror of hope, before I put it all neatly away and started thinking about Monday. The pack found out about me within 2 days. I learned later that in a town like Cresthaven, everyone finds out everything within 2 days. It's the nature of places organized around pack structure. Information moves along social bonds the way water moves along roots, quick and thorough and reaching further than you'd expect. What I heard when I went into town for groceries on Saturday morning was a version of myself that I didn't entirely recognize. The stray omega the Preston Alpha dragged in. Packless. You know what that means. Probably in some kind of trouble. Why else would someone show up with no ties, no history, nothing? I was standing in the cereal aisle when I heard it. In a conversation not quite quiet enough behind me, 2 women, both carrying the pack scent I was beginning to identify as the dominant local group, the Cresthaven pack proper, the one Jacob was nominally connected to as their leading alpha family. They weren't speaking to me. They were speaking about me in the pointed way that's designed to be heard while maintaining the social fiction of privacy. I picked up my box of oatmeal with exactly the same unhurried movement I'd have used if they hadn't been speaking at all. Then I finished my shopping, paid for my groceries, and walked back to my car with the smooth, controlled neutrality that is one of the most exhausting things about being an unaffiliated omega in a pack town. You can't react. Reaction reads as aggression, which is then interpreted as proof of the instability they'd already decided you had. You just absorb it, carry it, file it somewhere it won't interfere with function. I drove back to the estate with my groceries and my filed-away feelings and spent the rest of Saturday making the cottage more mine. Not a lot, just enough. A book on the nightstand, the photograph of my grandmother on the kitchen windowsill, my spare blanket draped over the back of the armchair by the fire, small territorial assertions that packed no social meaning to anyone who might observe them, but mattered enormously to me. Sunday was quiet. I explored the property on my own, getting familiar with the acres I'd be maintaining, the formal garden near the house, the wilder grounds further back. the small greenhouse that had been closed up for winter but was still structurally sound, the stone paths that connected everything like a handwritten map. I didn't see Jacob. Lights were on in the main house in the evening, and once I heard music from somewhere low and indistinct. But he gave me my day off and I gave him his privacy, and we each seemed to understand that this was the correct behavior. Monday morning, 7. I knocked on the back door of the main house. He answered almost immediately, with coffee for himself and, without asking, a second mug held out toward me. Just left it on the counter within reach, not making a thing of it. I took it, hot, strong, exactly the way I would have made it. We spent the morning in the greenhouse, going through what needed to happen over the coming months. He knew his property in the attentive way of someone who genuinely loved it, rather than someone who'd inherited it and considered it a burden. He could name things. He knew what had been planted where, what had struggled, what had surprised him, what he'd learned the hard way. He spoke about the garden with a combination of knowledge and affection that I found, against my intentions, genuinely charming. "You know plants," I said at one point. It came out sounding like an accusation. The corner of his mouth did that thing again. "I do. Does that surprise you? Most alphas with this much land delegate the knowing. Most alphas with this much land have more people to delegate to." He was examining a dormant rosebush, checking the base of the canes for damage. "Besides, if you can't look after something yourself, you don't deserve to call it yours." I filed that away in a different part of my mind, not the part I used for absorbing unpleasantness. The other part, the one I tried to keep small. By the end of the first week, I'd established a rhythm. Mornings in the grounds, afternoons either in the greenhouse or doing minor repairs. There was always something on a property this old. Stone walls needed repointing. A gate hinge. Drainage clearing. I liked the physicality of it. I liked the way work made time move differently. The way purpose fills space that anxiety would otherwise colonize. Jacob moved through the main house with a self-contained ease that I found myself mapping, not strategically but reflexively. Omega instinct, always tracking the alpha in any space, always knowing where the door was and where the closest alpha was and what their mood frequency looked like. I'd hated that instinct for years. In pack situations, it had always felt like surveillance I'd never consented to. But here it registered differently. Here the tracking told me, consistently and without alarm, stable, present, no threat incoming, which was new, genuinely new. He worked from home several days a week, something in property management, I gathered. Some administrative work that he did from an office on the second floor. On those days, I'd sometimes look up from the garden and see his silhouette in the window, looking at papers or a screen, completely absorbed. Once or twice he looked up at the same moment I did. Neither of us looked away quickly. That detail registered too, in the part of my mind I was trying to keep small. Thursday of that first week, it rained. Not the polite kind of autumn rain, the kind that came in sideways, the kind that explained why all the trees on this property were such magnificent specimens because they'd survived many winters of exactly this. I was in the garden when it started, and by the time I'd decided to head in, I was thoroughly soaked. I was shaking off my jacket on the back porch when the door opened and Jacob was there with a towel. Not a small, insufficient towel, a proper, large one. He held it out without ceremony. "You were watching for me to come in," I said. "I was watching the rain," he said. "Come inside." I followed him into the kitchen, which was warm and smelled of something he'd been cooking. Soup, I realized, something with herbs. He poured me coffee without asking and pushed it toward me on the counter. "I have a kitchen," I said. "In the cottage." "You do," he agreed. "It's also 150 meters away in a rainstorm and the soup is already made, so..." He gestured at the table. "Sit." I sat. He served us both without fuss, and we ate at the big kitchen table with the rain hammering the windows, and for a while, we didn't talk at all. Not the silence of awkwardness. The silence of two people who were discovering, with some mutual surprise, that they were comfortable in each other's quiet. "Tell me something about yourself," he said eventually. "That's a wide request. I know. That's why I made it wide. Narrow questions get narrow answers. I considered this. I used to paint. Watercolors. I haven't in about 2 years. Why'd you stop? Moved around too much. It got impractical." This was true and also incomplete. but incomplete was as much as I was ready to offer. He accepted it without pushing. I have a room upstairs that I don't use, he said. Good light, north-facing. It's just storage right now, but it doesn't need to be. I looked at him. You're offering me a painting studio. I'm mentioning that there's a north-facing room with good light that isn't being used, he said, and that you're welcome to it. Jacob. Gary. We looked at each other across the kitchen table with the rain making its argument against the windows. Something in the air between us was, I want to find the right word for it because it matters, and easy words would be dishonest. It wasn't simple attraction, though that was present and I knew it. It was something older and quieter. The specific electricity of two people recognizing something in each other that they'd both spent time believing they might never find. An unaffiliated omega and a solitary alpha, eating soup in a rainstorm. Thank you, I said, for the room, for the soup, for the towel, for the coffee, for the cottage, for asking before assuming, for not making me perform my harmlessness for him every minute of every day. He nodded. Stop thanking me for things that don't require it. The pack's opinion of me coalesced over the following 2 weeks into something specific enough to have a shape. I heard it from Callum, one of the town's mid-rank members who sometimes came to do odd jobs on the estate, and who seemed constitutionally unable to filter his thoughts before speaking. He arrived on a Friday morning to fix a section of fence, and within an hour he'd told me, with the particular cheerful thoughtlessness of someone who doesn't consider you quite real enough to be hurt by information about yourself, that the pack had decided I was a gold digger, that I'd turned up specifically to attach myself to the lone alpha on the hill, that my packless status was proof of poor character, or unstable dynamics, or possibly some kind of social contamination that might affect Jacob's standing. They're not bad people, Callum said, nailing a fence post with impressive accuracy for someone conducting gossip simultaneously. Just protective of Jacob. He's had a hard few years, his last relationship. He paused, seemed to think better of continuing. Anyway, they're watching out for him. By calling me a stray, I said. Callum had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable. Pack language isn't personal. It's always personal, I said pleasantly. It's just not personal to you. He didn't have a response for that. I went back to my work. The thing about being called a stray is that it has history behind it, layered history. Stray implies that you were once somewhere you belonged and then you left, or worse, that you were rejected. That your packlessness is a verdict rather than a circumstance. That someone, somewhere, looked at you and decided you weren't worth keeping. My history with pack dynamics was complicated. I'd been born to a pack family, which gave me the illusion of belonging right up until adolescence, when my secondary gender designation came in, Omega. My parents hadn't been cruel exactly. Cruelty requires intention, and they were mostly just confused. Caught between genuine love and the weight of expectations they'd never questioned. My father had wanted a beta son, or failing that, an alpha. An omega son had required him to revise his entire understanding of who I was and what my future looked like, and the revision had been slow and imperfect. I'd left at 19, not dramatically. No midnight departure, no slammed doors, just left. Built something independent that was entirely mine, which is hard to do as an omega outside pack structure, but not impossible if you're stubborn and willing to be tired. I'd moved 4 times in 5 years. I'd had 2 jobs that felt like homes until they didn't. I'd had 1 relationship with an alpha who'd had a pack and had initially seemed like he was offering me a place in it, until I understood that what he was actually offering was the outer orbit of his life. The thing that happened when everything else was accounted for. I'd left that too. So yes, stray. Not because I couldn't stay, but because nowhere had ever been worth staying for. And if that made me an object of suspicion in Cresthaven, if my wandering looked like evidence of damage rather than evidence of standards, then I suppose that was something I'd have to outlast. What I hadn't expected was Jacob. He came to find me in the greenhouse one evening about 10 days into the job. Not unusual, he checked in regularly, genuinely interested in the work. But this time he wasn't talking about the garden. Callum mentioned he said something to you, he said. He was standing near the door, not crowding the space, hands in his jacket pockets. His expression had the carefully controlled quality of someone who is angry and is choosing to be precise about it. Callum mentions a lot of things, I said. It's a genuine talent. Pete told you what the pack is saying about you. He did. It's fine, Jacob. It isn't. There was a firmness in his voice, not raised, not performative, just firm, like a load-bearing wall. You're under my roof. My territory. My. He paused for a fraction of a second. My employ. What's said about you while you're here is something I have an opinion about. You can't control what people think. I can make clear what I expect, he said. Which is what I did this morning. Pack meeting. I made clear that you're here because I asked you to be, that your status is not the pack's business, and that the language being used is another pause. Not something I'm willing to tolerate. I stared at him. You called a pack meeting about me. About expectations. Which happened to involve you, yes. He was watching me with that steady gray-green attention. Does that bother you? Did it bother me? I turned the feeling over carefully. An alpha going to the mat with his own pack on behalf of an unaffiliated omega he'd known for 2 weeks, that should have felt like debt. Like obligation incurred without consent. In almost every other version of this dynamic I could imagine, it would have been a move. Here's what I did for you. Here's what you owe me. But Jacob's face was not making a move. It was asking a genuine question. It was waiting for the actual answer. It surprises me, I said finally. Most people in your position would find it easier to let it go. Most people in my position haven't spent much time thinking about what it costs people like you when it gets let go. He looked at the dormant trays of seedlings I'd been organizing, the small signs of future growth. My mother, he said, quieter. I watched her navigate this kind of thing for years before the pack accepted her fully. After she and my father bonded, it took years and she was bonded. For someone without that, he didn't finish the sentence, but the weight of it was complete. She was lucky to have someone who saw it, I said. So are you, he said simply. Not with arrogance. With the same plain steadiness he applied to everything, as if saying you are worth being seen and I see you was not a grand declaration but simply a fact he'd identified and was reporting accurately. I turned back to the seedling trays. My hands weren't entirely steady. Thank you, Jacob, I said, looking at the trays. You told me to stop saying that. You told me to stop saying that, I corrected. No one gave me the same instruction. From behind me, I heard something that might have been a quiet laugh. The north-facing room became mine gradually, the way things become real when you're afraid of wanting them too much. Jacob cleared it one weekend, almost entirely on his own. I helped carry boxes, and we worked quietly together in the way we become accustomed to, side by side, efficient, communicating in the practical shorthand that develops between people who've learned to read each other's movements. When the room was clear, he'd set up an old easel he'd found somewhere in the estate's storage, not mine, but similar to the one I'd sold 2 moves ago, and left it in the center of the space without comment. I bought paint on my next trip to town. Not a lot. My first paycheck had come through and I was being careful, old habit, but enough to start. Tubes of primary colors and 2 or 3 others, a selection of brushes, a block of watercolor paper. I painted badly for the first 2 weeks. This is normal after a gap. The hands remember less than you expect, and what they do remember is the old patterns, the ways you'd been before, not the ways you've become. I painted badly and I didn't stop, because stopping is the failure and continuing is just the work. Jacob never came into the room uninvited, but sometimes, on the days he was working from home, on the days the house was quiet and the winter light came through those north-facing windows in that particular cool, honest way, I'd be aware of him somewhere below or in the hallway outside, and the awareness was not alarm. It was the opposite. It was the thing that let my brush move more freely than it had in 2 years. I was painting him by the 3rd week, though I didn't admit this to myself for a while. Or not him, exactly. His garden. His land. But gardens and land hold the shape of the people who tend them, and what I was putting on paper, in blues and grays and the warmth of autumn earth tones, was unmistakably in his image. The way his property felt. The way his presence in a room reorganized the air of it. The specific quality of safety that I hadn't known I'd been looking for until I found it here, on a north-facing hill in a town that had called me a stray. Safe. It was an enormous, terrifying word. I'd stopped trusting it somewhere around 21. December arrived with snow. The estate in snow was... The word that came was cathedral. The silver-barked trees holding white along their branches. The garden's winter architecture softened, but not erased. The stone of the cottage and the main house, the same steady gray against the white ground. I woke the first morning of real snow to find that the cottage walk had been cleared before I was up, and a note on my door, "Take the morning off. Fireplace is on inside." The inside was the main house. He'd left the back door unlocked. I stood in the doorway for a moment reading this, while my breath made small clouds in the cold air. Then I went inside and found coffee already made and a fire already lit, and Jacob was in the kitchen making breakfast, and he looked up when I came in and said, "Eggs or pancakes?" as if this were entirely normal. "Eggs," I said. "What time did you clear the walk?" 6. "You did it by hand. The plow attachment on the tractor is broken. I've been meaning to fix it." He cracked eggs into a pan with an ease that meant he'd done this many times. "Sit." I sat at the kitchen table and wrapped my hands around the coffee mug and watched him cook, and I thought, this is the most domestic I have felt since I was a child in my grandmother's kitchen. And even then it didn't feel quite like this, because even then I understood that it was temporary, that I would grow up and the belonging would have to be rebuilt from scratch in a world that wasn't automatically designed for me. "Jacob," I said. Why are you alone?" It came out more direct than I'd planned, but he'd established from the first day that he preferred the direct version of things. He was quiet for a moment, spatula in hand, eggs nearly done. Then he turned and plated them and brought them to the table and sat across from me, and he said, "Same reason as you, I imagine. I kept looking for something that matched what I was looking for, and it kept not. You had someone, though. Callum mentions too much. No sharpness in it. Just accuracy. 2 years ago, an Omega I'd been with for 18 months. Pack approved, all the right signals." He looked down at his plate. "She wanted to be mated to the Preston name. Not to me. It took me a year and a half to be sure of the difference, and another 6 months to do anything about it. I'm sorry. It was the right call. Just expensive." He looked up. "You?" 1. Lasted almost a year. He wanted an Omega for his outer orbit. I picked up my fork, not really looking to be anybody's satellite. Something crossed Jacob's face. I might have called it recognition. "No," he said. "That would be a waste." I ate a bite of eggs. They were excellent. I focused on the eggs for a moment because the alternative was focusing on the way those 4 words had landed. That would be a waste, and the part of my mind I'd been keeping small was insisting that it had the right to get a little bigger now. That maybe I had earned it. "It's good," I said about the eggs. "My grandmother's recipe," he said. And the way he said it, just that, just the simple fact of inheritance, of a family recipe carried forward, made something in my chest do a complicated thing. We ate in the snow quiet of the kitchen, with the fire and the coffee and the December light coming through the windows like a photograph of something I might have been permitted, finally, to keep. The pack sent a delegation the following week. 3 of them, which was the number that meant official. Not hostile, not friendly. Formal. I recognized it immediately when I opened the cottage door. The deliberate neutrality of faces, the careful arrangement of posture, the subtle pack pheromone signature that all 3 were broadcasting at the controlled frequency of people on formal business. 2 betas and an Omega woman. I thought that was strategic. Sending the Omega was an attempt at something, a softening or a signal. Their names were Roe, Hadley, and Miranda. Roe did most of the talking. What the pack wanted, translated from the formal language of territorial diplomacy into plain sense, was reassurance about my intentions, about my history, about what I wanted from Jacob Preston, their alpha family's representative, the person they'd spent years trying to find an appropriate match for. It was not, they were at pains to insist, an interrogation. "I understand," I said. We were standing on the cottage porch because I hadn't invited them in, which was my right and which Roe clearly noted. "What would reassure you?" "Information," Roe said. "Background, previous pack affiliations, why you left your last position." "I've never had a pack affiliation," I said. "I was born into a family with pack membership, and I left my family's home at 19. Since then I've been independent. My last position was as a grounds manager at a botanical garden 2 cities east of here. I left because the funding was cut and the position was eliminated. References available on request. And for that, various positions. I move when I need to. I stay when I can. I looked at Ro. What you actually want to know is whether I'm here to exploit your alpha. The answer is no. I took a job because I needed one, and I've done that job to the best of my ability. What happens between me and Jacob is between me and Jacob. Miranda, the Omega, spoke for the first time. Do you have feelings for him? The bluntness of it surprised me enough that I paused before answering, not to manufacture an answer, but because the honest one required a moment to collect. I think the more relevant question is whether he has the right to form his own opinions about who he spends his time with, I said. I'm not here to bypass your pack's input, but I'm also not going to submit to an approval process to justify my presence on private property where I've been invited. A long moment. Ro and Hadley looked at each other. Miranda looked at me, and her expression did something unexpected, shifted slightly, toward something that might have been respect. You're not what I thought you'd be, she said. People rarely are, I said. What did you think I'd be? Easier to dismiss, she said simply. After they left, I sat on the cottage porch in the cold for a long time, arms wrapped around myself, watching the snow on the garden. Then I went inside and lit the fire and did not think about what Miranda had meant by that, or what the look on her face had contained, or whether it was a good sign or something I'd been misreading. I tried not to think about Jacob. This was, as it had been for about 3 weeks now, not entirely successful. He appeared at the cottage door that evening. The delegation came to see you, he said. It wasn't a question. They did. Are you? He stopped. Looked at me. Started again. How are you? Fine. I stepped back from the door. Come in. He came in and sat in the armchair by the fire, and I made tea because it was something to do with my hands. And when I brought it over and sat on the hearth across from him, not far, the cottage being the size it was, he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him before. Unguarded, in a way, like he'd removed something deliberate. I didn't know they were coming, he said. I should have. I'm sorry. You don't need to apologize for other people. They're my pack. Their behavior is something I carry. He had his tea and he wasn't drinking it, just holding it. Gary, I want to tell you something, and I need you to tell me if it changes things. My heart did a quiet, careful thing. All right, I said. Since you've been here, he stopped. Chose words with the same precision he applied to everything. I haven't been lonely in the way I'd gotten used to being lonely. That's not a small thing. For me, it's been, I wasn't sure it was still possible. He looked at the fire rather than at me, which I understood was not evasion but honesty. Some things are easier to say to a fire. I'm not telling you this to put pressure on you. I know what your situation is, what it's cost you to be independent, what the pack politics are. I know you didn't come here for this, but I'd rather tell you than not and let you do what you want with it. The fire was the same fire that had been here when I arrived. The warmth of it hadn't changed, but something in the room had shifted its weight distribution, redistributed itself around a new center of gravity. Jacob, I said. He looked at me. I've been painting your garden for 3 weeks, I said. I'd like you to see it. His expression did something slow and profound, like ice becoming water. I'd like that, he said. Tomorrow, I said. Come at the good light. Morning. I'll be there. We finished our tea. He left. The cottage felt different after the door closed. Fuller somehow, even though it now held one fewer person than it had a moment before, full of what had been said and what hadn't needed to be. I sat by the fire for a long time, in the warmth of a room that was beginning, incrementally, to feel like mine. He came at 9, when the winter light was at its best, pale and clean and mercilessly honest, the kind of light that doesn't allow for impressionism or softening. Everything in a north-facing room at 9 in the morning was exactly what it was. I had the paintings arranged around the room. Not many, 12, maybe 15 finished pieces, but enough to constitute something. A body of work. A record of the past weeks as I'd experienced them from the inside. Jacob stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, looking. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I had to actively resist the anxiety of misreading the silence. But I'd learned Jacob's silences by now. I knew which ones were processing and which ones were discomfort. And this was the former. That's the greenhouse, he said, stopping in front of one piece. Yes, in spring, how it looks in spring. He looked at me. How do you know what it looks like in spring? You arrived in November. The structures were there, I said. The bones of it. I extrapolated. He turned back to it. You got it right. He moved slowly around the room. Stopped in front of the large piece I'd put last. The main house, seen from the stone path, with the silver-barked trees on either side. The smoke from the chimney. The light in the upstairs window. The specific atmosphere of a place that holds a person's full attention, a place whose details you know because you've been paying close attention to them for weeks. Gary, he said. Yes. Come here. The room was small enough that here was approximately 2 steps from where I was standing. I took them. Up close, without the space between us that we'd both been maintaining with careful discipline for 6 weeks, his scent was, I want to be honest about this, it was like coming in from the cold. Not overwhelming, not assertive, just warm and grounded and steady in the way that a very old, very deep-rooted tree is steady. The kind of steady that doesn't insist on itself because it doesn't need to. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to say no if the answer is no. I will, I said. I always have. Do you know what it would mean, he said, for me to formally acknowledge you as under my protection? Pack recognition. Registered with the pack as someone I'm committed to. My heart was doing the quiet, careful thing again, and this time it was considerably louder. I know what it means. Not just the practical implications, the social ones. The way the pack would read it. He was watching me with those gray-green eyes in the north light, and there was nothing in his expression except honesty. It would change things, how people see you here, what access you have, what security. It would also change what I owe, I said, not defensively. Just because I needed him to know I understood the shape of this. No, he said. That's not how I operate. What you'd owe would be the same as what I'd owe you, mutual, not transactional. I breathed. In through my nose, slow, the way I did when I was calibrating. The room smelled like fresh paint and old stone and Jacob. I haven't belonged to anyone, I said, since I was 19, and I left then because the belonging was costing more than it gave. I know, he said, and I'm not asking you to belong to me. I'm asking if you'd be willing to build something that we both belong to. The distinction was not small. The distinction was, in fact, enormous. Yes, I said. The word left my mouth clear and unambiguous and true. Not a decision made in a moment, made over 6 weeks of morning coffees and rainstorms and quiet dinners and a north-facing room with good light. Made in the accumulation of every instance in which Jacob Preston had seen me clearly and chosen repeatedly, deliberately to stay in my vicinity. He raised his hand and I recognized what he was asking, permission to touch, offered before taken, the fundamental courtesy that I'd been taught to expect from alphas and had almost stopped believing in. I nodded. His hand came up to the side of my face, warm against my skin in the cold of the room, and he looked at me, one last long look that felt like something being confirmed rather than something being decided. When he kissed me, it was exactly what his scent had promised. Warm. Grounded. Steady. The kind of thing that doesn't perform itself because it doesn't need to. The pack meeting that Jacob called 3 days later was not, he told me afterward, quite the explosion he'd half expected. I wasn't there. He'd asked if I wanted to be, and I'd said, "This is your conversation with your people. Tell me what matters." He'd nodded and gone, and I'd spent the evening in the painting room with the fire on and the north-facing windows dark, finishing a piece I'd been working on for a week. His hands, the specific shape of them, the way they moved in the garden, competent and careful. The way one of them had felt against my face. He came back at 9. I heard the back door of the main house and then his footsteps on the stone path and then a knock on the cottage door. He always knocked, had done from the first day, and when I opened it he looked like someone who'd survived something and wasn't entirely sure how he felt about having survived it. "Come in," I said. He came in. I put the kettle on. He sat at the cottage table, which was smaller than the kitchen table in the main house, and ran a hand through his hair. "Mixed," he said. "Mostly mixed." Ro was. A pause. "Ro has known me a long time. He has opinions." "What kind of opinions?" "That it's too fast." That he doesn't know enough about you. That the pack should have been consulted before. He stopped. Before you decided you wanted an unaffiliated stray omega associated with your name, I said, even-voiced. Just the fact. He looked up sharply. Before I made a commitment that affects pack dynamics, that's the actual concern, without the editorial. I made the tea, brought it to the table, sat. He's not wrong that it's fast. No, Jacob agreed. He's not. Are you having doubts? The question sat in the room between us. He looked at me for a long moment, and in his expression I could read. I was good at reading him now, better than I was at reading most people, the texture of genuine consideration. Not performance of consideration, the actual thing. No, he said. Certainty for me has never been a function of time. I know what I know. I've known what I know about you since. Another pause. Since you stood in my doorway the first day and looked at the property like you were already trying to understand it, like you were paying attention because the place deserved it, not because you were trying to make an impression. He picked up his tea. That's not common, Gary. That kind of attention. I looked at the table. Miranda didn't object, I said, because I'd been thinking about her. Miranda said to tell you that she found you not easy to dismiss. A trace of warmth in his voice now, through the tiredness. In the pack language, that's essentially a standing ovation. I laughed. It surprised me, came out light and genuine, and I hadn't expected it. He smiled, and the tiredness in his face shifted around it. What happens now? I asked. Ro comes around, he said. He always does. He's protective because he cares, and when he's satisfied that I know what I'm doing, the care wins over the protection. He wrapped both hands around his mug. The rest will take time. Pack dynamics always do. But I've told them what I've decided, and they know I don't decide things lightly. Jacob, I looked at him across the small table in the cottage that had become mine in the space of a month, in the house his grandmother had probably also sat in a life that was still surprising me by existing. What did you tell them exactly? He met my eyes. The fire was warm. The December dark was outside the windows. I told them your name, he said, and I told them what comes after it. The name he meant was Preston. I knew it without him saying it. He hadn't pushed, hadn't even said it. Exactly, just gestured toward it. Let it exist as a possibility offered rather than a conclusion imposed. Gary Louis Preston, I said quietly, trying the weight of it. He was watching me, not with expectation, with the particular quality of attention he'd given me from the first day. Patient, curious, genuinely interested in what I would do with this. Give me the week, I said, not as hesitation, as honor. I want to arrive there on my own terms, however long you need, he said. But we both knew, sitting in the cottage, in the fire warmth, with the winter outside and 6 weeks of morning coffee and snow and north-facing light and quiet dinners between us, that the week was already decided. I spent that week the way I'd spent most important things in my life, working, hands in soil even in December, because there is always something to do in a garden if you know how to look for it. Overwintering work. Structural work, planning work, thinking through what spring would require, what I wanted to build in the greenhouse through the cold months, what this land could become in my hands over years. Over years. That was new, the word years in relation to a place, to a person, to a life that had a specific address attached to it. I sat in the painting room one evening and looked at what I'd made over the past weeks, the greenhouse in spring. The main house under the silver trees, the garden in all its winter geometry. A study of a hand, his hand, that I'd been avoiding looking at too directly. I'd been painting a home. I understood this finally, looking at the collection of it. Not his home exactly, the home I'd found inside the space he'd offered, the home that was mine because I'd made it mine, with the paints and the work and the early mornings and the coffee on the kitchen counter and the quiet dinners. And all of it. My grandmother had smelled like lavender and certainty. Her car still did sometimes. I sat in it that Thursday morning, parked in front of the cottage, with the engine off, the windows beginning to fog with my breath. You have my last name, she'd told me once, years ago. That's not nothing. Wherever you go, you carry something of mine. I'd understood it as love then. I understood it differently now, as the first version of what Jacob was offering. The radical, ordinary act of giving someone your name as if to say, "You are my people, you belong to this." I got out of the car. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of cold that sharpens everything, that makes the edges of the world precise. The silver-barked trees were very still. The garden was waiting as it always was for what came next. I knocked on the back door of the main house. Jacob answered with coffee, already made, held out without asking. I took it. His hands were warm when they briefly touched mine in the exchange. "Gary," he said. "Preston," I said. "I want it. Gary Lewis Preston. I've decided." The word decided carries weight when you've spent 5 years learning how to make decisions that no one else would underwrite, when the only signature on your choices has been your own, and you've gotten good enough at signing that you've almost forgotten what it might feel like to sign with someone. Jacob looked at me, in the morning light, in his kitchen doorway, with coffee and the smell of wood smoke and the very particular scent of him, pine, stone, warmth. The expression on his face was not triumph. It was not even exactly happiness, though happiness was in it. It was something quieter and more durable, relief and recognition, and something that had the quality of a decision long carried finally set down. "Come in," he said. I came in. The kitchen was warm. The fire was going. Outside, the silver-barked trees held their winter patience, and the garden waited for spring, and somewhere in the north-facing room upstairs, the paintings of a home I'd made stood in the morning light. He set down his coffee, and I set down mine, and the space between us, always carefully maintained, always respected, closed. "I want to say it properly," he said, very quietly. "Gary Lewis Preston, my family name. My territory. My—" He stopped and looked at me with everything unguarded. "Mine, not possession." I knew the difference now. Mine the way a garden is yours when you've tended it through winter. Mine the way a home is yours when you've made it. Not built it from scratch, but made it real with your presence in it. Mine the way two people can be each other's when they've chosen each other deliberately, carefully, in full knowledge of the cost and the weight and the extraordinary terrifying gift. "Yours," I said. He took my face in both hands this time, both warm, both steady, and when he kissed me it tasted like arriving, like the specific quality of January mornings when the light is different than December, sharper angled toward spring, and you know you can feel it in the earth and in the air. That something has shifted in the direction of warmth. Miranda came in March, on a Wednesday when the first crocuses were up in the garden, pushing through the stone-cold earth with the absolute confidence of things that have waited long enough. She came not as a delegation, but alone, which meant something different. She brought bread she'd baked herself, which in pack language means offering rather than assessment. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table of the main house, the three of us, Jacob who had work calls but pushed them to the afternoon, and Miranda and me. And it was not exactly comfortable, not yet, but it was honest, which is better. She looked at me across the table with the eyes of someone who'd been revising a first impression since December, and she said, "You've done something to this house. The garden is coming up well," I said. "Not the garden." She looked around the kitchen, at the painting I'd hung by the window, the greenhouse in spring, the one Jacob had asked for, at the easy arrangement of things, the coffee cups that had specific places now, the general evidence of a house that had someone in it who noticed it. "The house," she said. I didn't know what to say to that. He was very solitary, she said to Jacob, but also to me. Before. She wrapped her hands around her mug. "We were worried about him." "I know," Jacob said. "We were wrong about you," she said to me now. Direct. No qualification. "I said so at the meeting in January. I want to say it to your face." Something shifted in my chest. Not surprise. I'd thought she might, eventually. But the timing of it, the fact that she'd come and said it in person rather than sending word to the pack channels, meant something. "Thank you," I said. "Gary Louis Preston," she said. Just the name, as if testing how it sat in the air. It sat fine. It sat like something that had always been waiting to exist and had finally been given permission. The crocuses were purple and yellow and white in the garden outside the kitchen window. The silver-barked trees were beginning to bud. In the greenhouse, the trays of seedlings I'd been tending since February were taller than I'd expected, reaching toward the glass and the thin spring light. Jacob caught my eye across the table, over Miranda's shoulder. The look was, I won't try too hard to describe it. It was the look of someone who is where they want to be and knows it. It was the look I was probably giving back to him because I am not good at hiding things from people who know how to look for them. And Jacob Preston had known from very early on how to look for me. Miranda stayed for lunch. Then she went home carrying a jar of the preserves I'd made from the estate's stores, something I'd started in January, something I was going to keep doing. She took it carefully, like it was something precious, which perhaps in pack language it was, the evidence of a home that produces things, that grows and keeps and gives. In the afternoon, with Jacob on his work calls and the house quiet, I went to the painting room. I'd started a new piece that week. The kitchen table, 2 coffee cups, morning light, the suggestion of 2 people who'd recently been sitting there. Not detailed enough to be portrait, abstract enough to be interpretation, but honest, the most honest thing I'd painted yet, because it required admitting in pigment and water and paper that I was painting a life I had and not one I was imagining. I stood in front of it for a while, brush in hand, and thought about my grandmother and her car and the lavender smell of certainty. Then I sat down and went to work. Later. Not that same spring, but a year out, with the garden in full second summer glory and the greenhouse full and the painting room full and the kitchen table still carrying 2 coffee cups every morning, like a ritual neither of us had designed, but both of us kept. Jacob would tell me that he'd known. From the day I pulled up in that parking lot looking at the property like I was paying it genuine attention that whatever happened next was going to matter. He hadn't known the shape of it. Hadn't known it would be this, the 2 of us, his name and mine together. The garden and the north-facing room and the slow repair of all the ways a person can come to believe they aren't worth staying for. I would tell him about the $43 in my wallet that first day. The car that smelled like my grandmother. The 2 nights I'd slept in it. All the things I'd held carefully out of sight, afraid of being confirmed in what I'd half suspected. That I was too damaged, too packless, too stray to be worth the effort of welcome. He would listen to all of it without the expression I dreaded. Not pity, not retroactive rescue narrative, not the gentle condescension of someone who needs you to have been helpless so they can feel heroic. He would just nod. Take my hand. Look at me the same way he always had from the beginning, like I was exactly what I was and it was sufficient. More than sufficient. The pack came around, as he'd said Roe always did when he was satisfied. It took most of the spring. Miranda had done something quiet and effective behind the scenes that I only understood later, and Callum, earnest, tactless, unfailingly kind in his bumbling way, had apparently spent several weeks telling anyone who'd listen that the new groundskeeper had done something extraordinary to the estate garden and perhaps ought to be given a chance. The estate garden was extraordinary by summer. I won't be modest about this, I'd worked very hard. The roses along the south wall were the best they'd been in years. The greenhouse was productive beyond what the previous season had managed. The stone paths were clear and well maintained, and in the wild section at the back of the property I'd been slowly introducing species that would build habitat over years. Not for us, exactly, but for the land itself, for what it might become. That's the thing about belonging somewhere. Once you know you're staying, you start thinking about what comes after you. What you're building toward, what you want to leave. I had a grandmother's name and now I had another one. 2 inheritances, the certainty that had been given to me young, and the certainty I'd built myself across 24 years of not finding where I was going. And this 3rd thing, Gary Louis Preston, a stray omega who'd been given a name by a pack that didn't want him and had given it back to them. And had gone north in a dead grandmother's car with $43 and a grief he was still carrying, and had knocked on a door and been let in. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even 1 member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.